There's one word that repeatedly comes to mind when I think of Sonic Superstars, and that word is surprise. Some of these surprises were great. Others, I wish Sega had kept the receipt. First, its announcement trailer in June. Considering Sega's focus was seemingly on the Sonic Frontiers DLC, I didn't expect another Sonic project yet. Since then, we've also had the announcement of Dream Team. Second was its release date of 17th October 2023, just 4 months after its reveal. We had to wait 5 years between the dual release of Sonic's Mania and Forces in 2017 and the dual releases of Sonic's Origins and Frontiers in 2022. I wasn't expecting a new Sonic game until 2027, so getting Superstars was a shock. Third, it being a 2D entry in the franchise after Takashi Iizuka stated that Frontiers and Open Zone would set the template for Sonic games for the next 10 years. I assumed all of Sega's eggs were in that one basket. Fourth, that I should technically say 2.5D because it ditches my beloved pixel visuals for 3D models. Could this be a sign that they were no longer banking on the nostalgia of the classic titles? Fifth, that development details had been outsourced to Arzest, who are most well known in the Sonic community for their work on, oh boy, Balan Wonderworld. Sixth, that it continually and repeatedly reminded me of a previous 2.5D Sonic game, Sonic the Hedgehog 4, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Once I had the game in hand and started playing it, there were many more surprises, good and bad. However, for those we'll need to finally get into the review proper. I consider the game to be recent enough that I've split this review into 3 sections. The first is simply labelled Safe. This section is for people who haven't played the game for themselves yet, but are curious about my thoughts on it, or are on the fence about buying it. There may be minor visual spoilers of some later stages, bosses, or Chaos Emerald powers, but there are no story spoilers, secret unlocks, or other things that would upset most people. I do emphasise most people, as I'm sure there's a small contingent who would find a reason to complain. If that vocal minority sounds like it might be you, do yourself a favour and play the game before watching any videos about it. The second is labelled Spoilers, and this allows me to talk about some more of those surprises. It assumes that you're curious about, or less sensitive towards, a degree of spoilers, and that you want context to some of the things I'll inevitably bring up, with a disclaimer of, we'll talk about other examples in the spoiler section. Finally, we have super spoilers. This section assumes you've either completed the game or that you just don't care about spoilers. It talks about late game unlocks, the story, and some cool hidden features. It's also the only way I can bring up some of my pros and cons about this game if you want my full opinion. It's also okay to change your mind, skip ahead, or selectively watch certain parts of the video. That's why I provide chapters, and I kind of expect the audience retention graph to look weird for this video. On that note, most people decide whether they're going to watch a video within the first 30 seconds. We're well beyond that threshold now, so there's a good chance you're liking what you're seeing and hearing. I'm sure you're tired of hearing this from every YouTuber, but please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really does help the channel out. With that said, I hope you're strapped in and ready, because we're about to take a trip to the North Star Islands. Sonic Superstars should feel immediately familiar to anyone who has played a side-scrolling Sonic before. You move left to right, you defeat badniks by jumping on or through them, you can survive almost any attack as long as you have one ring left, although there are some insta-kill exceptions, and you fight a boss at the end of each stage. Pre-release, I was concerned when friends of mine returned from EGX, saying that playing Superstars felt like going back to the PAL versions of the Mega Drive games. For those who don't know, PAL games typically ran around 18% slower than their NTSC counterparts. From their comments, I was expecting Sonic and his friends to feel slow, sluggish, heavy, and unresponsive. I'm happy to report that, while I respect my friend's opinions, I don't share them. This game felt mostly right to me, a guy who's been playing Sonic for 3 decades. I went back and did a direct comparison with Sonic Mania, which many fans consider to be perfect, and confirmed that Sonic's jump height and airtime seem to be identical. I also compared his acceleration, and he seems to get up to full speed in the exact same amount of time as he does in Mania. It's a little harder to directly compare his response to slopes and the like, but we can confirm that his jumping arc does change based on the grade he's standing on. He also still needs a run-up to get around a loop. There doesn't seem to be any automation there. So are my friends full of it? No, something definitely feels different, and I don't know if it's maybe just a placebo effect due to the new art style or a case of proportions. My criticisms of classic Sonic in Sonic's Generations and Forces were that the platforms, hazards, and enemies seemed massive, killing the sense of speed as it took longer to navigate these bigger objects. It felt like everything required more effort from Sonic. Superstars has better sized badniks and environments compared to Sonic and his friends, but 3D graphics over the prior pixel presentation means we now have a camera that can zoom in and out as needed, causing Sonic to take up less, or sometimes more, of the screen than we're used to. We now have real depth, instead of the artistically implied distance we had before. Maybe that's enough to make it feel different, despite being more or less the same. Regardless, unpopular opinion incoming, I think we place too much emphasis on the supposed accuracy of the physics and momentum when controlling Sonic and his crew. I find it hard to believe that, in 1991, using 16-bit hardware that had to fake physics and momentum, Sonic Team knocked it out of the park on the first attempt. We know that they continued tinkering with that secret sauce for Sonic's 2, CD, and 3 and Knuckles, with tweaks such as the removal of the speed cap. It wasn't right first time, and I feel we place it on a pedestal, holding on to a shared perception of Sonic's controls that simply doesn't stack up to reality. For comparison, Half-Life 2, released in 2004, 13 years after Sonic 1, was praised for its groundbreaking physics. Even Sonic Adventure, in my opinion the best Sonic has ever controlled in a 3D space, predates this. It was released in 1998 in Japan and 1999 for the rest of us. It faked its character's physics and momentum to an extent. It had to in the absence of other solutions. If anything, Sonic Superstars has the opportunity to use real, and arguably more accurate physics and momentum than any previous Sonic game, having been built in the Unity engine, which comes with built-in capsule colliders, rigid bodies, and gravity. What I care about is whether the characters feel responsive and fun to control, and whether those controls lend themselves to the level, enemy, and overall challenge design of the game they're in. An old argument is that you could put Sonic in a Mario level, and he can likely beat it without issue, but if you put Mario in a Sonic game, the plumber would fail. While some of you might feel that I'm moving the goalposts here, I'm happy to report that this game is designed around these characters and these controls. It feels good to play, not because it has the same arbitrary airtime and acceleration as Mania, but because it's built around the Sonic they have here. In addition to the basic tried and tested Sonic abilities, we also have new Chaos Emerald powers. In the past, we collected all 7 Chaos Emeralds to unlock Super Sonic, but we didn't get any incremental rewards on the way to Super. Superstars addresses that by giving us new abilities for each and every emerald we grab. Unfortunately, these powers are somewhat situational, and certainly weren't built equally. The biggest example of a wasted power is water. This allows you to climb waterfalls and swim freely underwater without fear of drowning. I only recall seeing waterfalls in Bridge Island and Lagoon City, the latter being the only level where I encountered pools of water deep enough to swim through. The worst offender is maybe Ivy, where the only spoiler-safe footage I have of it is the tutorial for unlocking it. That's maybe the only time I used it in my initial run. At the other end of the spectrum, slow is a power I wish I had earlier, especially at the end of Press Factory Act 2, where you're fighting a sometimes overly strict countdown timer that triggers an insta-kill gimmick, while Burst essentially adds an extra jump to every character. Separating these abilities from the wisps of previous games is that you can use them at will. You can only use the powers once each before having to refresh them at a star post. It's a freedom that's very much appreciated, even if it didn't encourage me to use those powers more regularly. There were times in my initial playthrough that I straight up forgot that I even had these powers. Not only are they situational, they're also tied to a somewhat clumsy right-stick radial menu that breaks the flow and pacing of a 2D Sonic game. The only remedies I can think of would be to toggle through abilities with L1 and R1, like weapon switching in older GTAs, or to maybe map each ability to a separate button, but with 7 abilities, that's a lot of buttons to keep track of, and I imagine it would become easy to activate the wrong thing at the wrong time. The game does prompt you to use certain abilities at certain times, especially the one that reveals hidden platforms and rings, but it doesn't go all in on this until much later when it can more safely assume you've unlocked these powers. More on that in the super spoilers section. Another way to change up the controls and the way the game plays is to change characters. Tails, Knuckles, and Amy join Sonic on this adventure, and, in my opinion, they're better integrated than they have been in other recent outings. You can now switch character at any time. You don't have separate save files for each of them. That means you don't have to play through the campaign 4 separate times. You also don't have to collect the Chaos Emeralds 4 times either, as the gang now shares progress. Each playable character also gets their own dedicated act in the story, levels that can only be played through as that specific freedom fighter. It encourages trying them out, getting a flavour for them, and, just maybe, doing another run as them. I don't have much to say about Tails. The little fox felt like a dream to play as. His flight was nice and smooth, he's still effectively easy mode, and when it comes to exploring stages for entrances to special stages, the new medals, or golden badniks, Tails is my first pick due to his sheer convenience. Knuckles has been a disappointment for many players, at least according to social media. I've heard cries that his glide is broken, he doesn't pull himself up consistently when climbing walls, and, thanks to something we'll cover in super spoilers, his overall presence and purpose is severely downplayed. I'm right there with people regarding the wall climb. Firsthand, he didn't always attach to climbable surfaces when it felt like he should have, he didn't consistently pull himself up when reaching the top of a wall, and jumping off a wall felt inconsistent and squirrely. The glide? I don't know guys, I didn't feel the startup delay people have been talking about. The general pace, turning time, and speed cap felt very similar to Mania's, with me even going back to do a quick check and validate my perceptions. It even still does a little bounce off enemies' heads. This seemed fine to me unless I'm missing something. Amy is in a weird spot. This is her 3rd playable appearance this year, having been added to Origins with its Plus DLC, and Frontiers with its Final Horizon DLC. And none of them play alike. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles are fairly consistent across the 2D games. I more or less know what to expect, and while speedrunners might notice slight differences, for 99% of players, that trio is always close enough. Between games, Amy goes from focusing on her Pico Pico hammer to almost exclusively using tarot cards, from having a double jump to a triple jump, none of which match her retro-playable outings in Adventure 1 or the Advanced Trilogy. She's so different across games that when someone says she's going to be playable, it's impossible for me to know what to expect, and that's absolutely a problem. That mechanical inconsistency means that she lacks the identity that her friends enjoy, to the point that hardcore fans argue differences in frame data for their jump heights across titles. She was also, unfortunately, subject to a preview that didn't shine her in the best light, and I'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the look and feel. Judging what we actually have, I really liked Amy. She felt like Sonic with a larger attack range and a double jump. So much so that when I finished her act and went back to playing as Sonic, I kept trying to double jump. My daughter was excited for her inclusion, already playing as her in Origins Plus. Representation matters, and I can see the kid happily doing a full run as the Rosie Rascal. One of the biggest wins for Superstars was that it would include entirely new and original levels. This was especially welcome after the overuse of Green Hill, Chemical Plant, and Sky Sanctuary over the past decade. Conceptually and aesthetically, these levels are a love letter to past games. In name alone, Bridge Island and Speed Jungle evoke memories of the 8-bit Sonic 1. Speed Jungle's vines bring back feelings of grinding in the advanced titles. Lagoon City felt like a tribute to 8-bit Sonic 2's Aqua Lake. Meanwhile, Golden Capital lifts its loops directly from Sonic 1's concept art. These developers clearly love and respect Sonic, and we'll talk about some more examples in the spoilers section, but these original zones can also feel very derivative and safe. Sky Temple is maybe a little too similar to Advance 2's Sky Canyon. Pinball Carnival is yet another riff on both Casino and Carnival Nights. Sand Sanctuary is just flat out Sandopolis with a new name, and I honestly mistook Frozen Base for Sonic 4 Episode 2's White Park. Well, it's Act 1 anyway. This was one of the first things to remind me of Sonic 4. Technically original zones, heavily inspired by what's come before, but with new names. I'm in two minds about whether this is an example of laziness, or whether there simply aren't any new zone ideas left under the sun. I'm also not convinced that recycled themes are even an issue. Mario games always start in a green field, then include the ice area, the desert levels, and the lava world before ending in Bowser's castle. We seem to be fine with that, so is it the end of the world if Sonic always starts on a tropical beach and ends up in a space station? For the most part, the levels flow fairly well, while distinguishing themselves apart through use of unique gimmicks and hazards. A couple of zones did stand out for the wrong reasons, with Cyber Station's squid areas feeling out of place. The mouse maze was also an unwelcome change. Press Factory immediately comes to mind for disruptive gimmicks. Act 1 has a piston in the background. It drops with a regular rhythm, forcing a jump. The level is built around it, and for once you're trying to stay on the lower routes rather than the higher ones, something I've not seen since Wacky Workbench. Like the Workbench though, it quickly becomes irritating. Act 2 ramps it up with an instant kill hazard in the background. It's constantly counting down until it fires at you, but you can reset the timer by jumping on certain pads. There's a section later on that, without the slow Chaos Emerald power, is just that little bit too strict, quickly becoming frustrating. There are other scattered gotcha moments, as early as the first zone in fact, but any annoyance is somewhat alleviated by this game's ditching of the classic live system. Sonic already has frequent checkpoints throughout its levels, and its ability to infinitely retry, and possibly even brute force tricky sections, increases our tolerance for what could otherwise be unfair deaths. Regretfully, that approach has a negative impact on the bosses, my second reminder of Sonic 4. These bosses are heavily cycle-based. The majority hang out in the background or hover just out of reach, with a specific part of their pattern offering a limited window of opportunity to attack. This means that a lot of time in boss fights is spent waiting and dodging. Among the worst offenders is a battle against Fang in Golden Capital. The fight has 3 distinct phases, and in between each phase, you have to dodge lava flows as Fang prepares his next vehicle in the background. These are auto-scrollers with seemingly no way to speed it up. That already makes this boss fight one of many where you're likely to spend more time fighting the boss than you did actually playing through the level to reach the battle. What's worse is that there are no checkpoints for each phase. If you die, you're sent all the way back to phase 1, and you've got to sit through every single one of Fang's upgrade sequences again. It's beyond tedious. Bosses could also benefit from some difficulty balancing. In this boss from Frozen Base, there are no rings offered to you during the battle. Due to it again being an auto-scroller, it's difficult to pick up any dropped rings when you get hit. Worse, as the floor is constantly breaking behind you, you can get hit while you have rings, only to be insta-killed by the bottomless pit that's chasing you. This fight in particular just needed to pop 3 rings at occasional key points along the route to make it a much fairer challenge. Now, some bosses aren't as automated, and they do provide extra opportunities for you to attack and abuse them, especially in co-op. For me, that's a Sonic boss. You learn and follow the pattern the first time, but then as your skill and familiarity grows, you try and pull off certain stunts and tricks for satisfying bonus hits. Of course, they also provide the option to just one-ring rule them if you get too bored or impatient. These bosses, by and large, ignore those rules, and they're worse experiences for it. There are 2 particular bosses that push those agitations to absolute extremes, but we'll talk about those in the spoiler and super spoiler sections respectively. As mentioned a moment ago, the game features both a co-op and battle mode. Co-op is exactly what it sounds like. Up to 4 players play through the main story mode together. I tried this out with my kids, and even with just 2 players, it was sadly a mess. The main issue of Sonic's co-op modes of the past, dating back to Sonic 2 on the Mega Drive, is the sheer speed of the game. Whoever was playing as Tails would constantly find themselves off-screen. Even though the camera does pull back to show more of the stage and try to keep everyone in frame, Sonic game design just doesn't suit co-op. The camera also can't decide who to follow. In the Mega Drive era, the camera was locked to Sonic, and as much as that sucked for Tails, it was at least consistent. Here, the camera switches which player it's following, seemingly on a whim. It becomes a massive issue in Speed Jungle Act 2, where you have limited light and visibility, because the visible area only shows around whoever the character is tracking. The second player is left to stumble around in the dark. The one upside is that what I call Little Brother mode is still very much a thing. Player 2 can cheese bosses as an invincible Tails, Amy, or Knuckles, sometimes. If a player dies in a boss fight, they're not allowed to respawn in order to maintain the challenge. However, these bosses are long and cycle-based. The remaining player might get bored waiting out animations before they can attack, but player 2 doesn't get to continue playing the game at all for potentially several minutes. It's a shame, as I thought Superstars would be a good game for us to play as a family, but if co-op mode is this broken and frustrating when just me and my son are playing, I can only assume that adding my wife and daughter to the mix for 4-player would be sheer chaos. Let's see if battle mode fares any better. You use your custom robots in a series of minigames such as collecting stars, fighting each other with chess beams, and good old-fashioned races. The first issue is that you're using a custom robot that requires you to grind for medals in the main game. After 2 playthroughs, I could just about afford the parts and paints for Metal Knuckles. It's another 50 medals for a second base robot, plus maybe another 70 or so for the parts and 40 for the paint if I want a second BattleBot. This means that, confusingly, both of us had to play as Metal Knuckles. The game doesn't automatically recolor player 2 either, so good luck telling each other apart when the action gets frantic, even though each player has their own screen. The minigames themselves are kind of basic and inoffensive. Fun enough to warrant us checking them out to once, but I can't see the kids asking to play Superstars Battle Mode over playing a dedicated multiplayer game like Street Fighter 6, Mario Kart 8, or good old Die Hard Arcade. Oddly, the minigames offered by Battle Mode aren't the furthest removed from the moment-to-moment action of the main game. There are also 2 types of special stage that you can find in the story levels. The first is entered via star posts and is based on Sonic 1's special stage, the old rotating maze. While I'm not usually a fan of these, Superstars does at least expand on the formula with some new tricks, hazards, and light puzzles, such as making you flip parts of the maze around. It's enough to make it feel new, but its reward of medals to spend on robot parts for battle mode didn't incentivize me to play many of these stages. The other is found by jumping into a hidden large ring, Sonic 3 and Knuckles style. It's a fully 3D environment where you swing around trying to chase a Chaos Emerald in what feels like we have Spider-Man 2 at home. The swings themselves feel kind of floaty, you don't feel like you're making progress or actually gaining any ground on the Emerald. The stages seem heavily reliant on these boost pads that shoot you towards the Emerald. In Sonic tradition, the hardest Emerald by far is the fifth one. It's a circular arena where the Emerald is constantly moving around the edge in a counterclockwise fashion. It also moves up and down, so you have to not only reach it, but match its height. This took me too many frustrating tries. You can only get one Emerald per zone, an arbitrary restriction that I've never been a fan of. If you enter a big ring in a zone where you already have the Emerald, you'll replay the stage with the Emerald replaced with a reward of medals. Sonic Superstars seems to rely on these medals, its customizable robots, and its battle mode for replayability. As mentioned earlier, at the end of 2 playthroughs I only had enough medals for 1 robot, so me and my son had to play as the same character. While there are medals hidden throughout the normal levels, in place of what would have been extra lives in older titles, your main method for farming them is abusing the 2 variety of special stages, and I'm sorry, they're just not for me. Not only that, but with the battle mode being underwhelming, I don't have anything meaningful to do with those robots once I've built them. Hence, zero incentive to participate in the grind that the game clearly wants me to do. Now, there is one other reason to want these custom robots, but again, spoiler section. I had hoped that I would want to do multiple runs of this game just for fun, but the game's length gets in its own way. I was fearful when I heard some single acts were 8 minutes long or more. I had flashbacks of Freedom Planet where stages outstayed their welcome. I was also hesitant about the overall zone count. There can be too much of a good thing. I'm more likely to play Sonic 3 and Knuckles as it's 2 separate games because the full adventure is too long to hold my attention for a single marathon session. Superstars has the same problem. Its campaign is, bare minimum, 2 sittings, more likely 3. It's a bigger commitment that makes replays off-putting, especially with its largely automated wait for an opening boss design, slowing things down even further. I don't see myself returning to Superstars as often as I do Sonic's 1 and 2, and for that reason, I'm doubtful that it will stand the test of time. That was also a concern when seeing the 3D modeled 2.5D presentation. For me, pixel art is timeless and ages like wine, but 3D can quickly look dated. In terms of asset quality and sheer polygon count, these graphics should scale and hold up fine. Sega has essentially been using derivatives of the models they use for Sonic's toy lines since Sonic Generations 12 years ago, and that game still looks pretty good to my eyes. I'm not sold on the materials and shaders used here. People complain that Sonic Adventure DX on the GameCube has a plastic quality, but I would say that the way this game's environments interact with light gives off more of a plasticine feeling, especially the vines in Speed Jungle, and I don't think that was the intention. Graphically, the game's competent, varied, pleasant enough, but nothing really stood out or wowed me. The biggest concern came from a preview of Amy's gameplay. This is a short section where she's carrying new character Trip, where people were quick to point out that she didn't have a proper jump animation. The developers just recycled her run animation, and yeah, this is lazy. I understand that you don't want to create a new suite of bespoke animations for a section that lasts a couple of minutes, but when you're making a platforming game, your character needs a jump animation. The music again reminded me of Sonic 4. It's this upbeat, seemingly synthesized and modernized take on the chiptune melodies of old. These are new tracks, but they feel familiar. That said, just like Sonic 4 Episodes 1 and 2, while the music was okay, I guess, none of it stuck with me after turning the game off. There's not a single memorable earworm that you'll find yourself humming at work or school. We're about to enter spoiler territory. Before we do that, for those of you who haven't picked up the game, want to remain spoiler-free, and just want my opinion before buying it, the game is better than I expected it to be. It held my attention, I had fun with it, it reaffirms my belief that Arzest isn't a bad developer, and Balan Wonderworld was just a case of them doing the best they could with a bad brief. There is a budget or B-game feeling to Superstars. I would not have felt satisfied if I'd paid full price. Here in the UK, the RRP for this game is $54.99. I managed to get a pre-order from a retailer for $39.99, and that feels much more reasonable for what's on offer here. I would definitely advise you to wait for a sale. Okay, let's enter some lighter spoiler territory. As a reminder, I've tiered the spoilers, so the big stuff is still to come in the super spoilers section. A small touch that I very much enjoyed was fighting your custom robot. When this boss first appeared, I hadn't engaged with robot building at all, so it was just the base dummy. I wondered, does this boss use my custom parts? Lo and behold, yes, you can make this a fight against pretty much any of the series' mechas, and that's simply awesome. The game is full of Easter eggs and callbacks to other Sega properties. The most enjoyable for me was this late stage that evokes Super Fantasy Zone. I mentioned earlier that it's obvious the development team love and respect the old Sonic games. We can see that through the use of splats as a badnik, the golden capital loops being straight out of old concept art, and level names and motifs being influenced by the Master System Sonics, to name a few. This entire stage encapsulates and celebrates that reverence, and I am 100% here for it. Act 2 of the final zone is an oddity. Robotnik starts rewinding time, and you repeat Act 1 in reverse. It's a cool concept, but Act 1 was already lingering around for longer than it should, with these slow laser rooms being a particular low point. Making me repeat such a long stage in what's effectively mirror mode was a bit of a cop-out. It also raised some story questions that we'll cover in the super spoilers section. When you do reach the end of that stage, you meet one of the more frustrating boss fights in Sonic history. It's not necessarily the difficulty or the length of the fight, but the forced repetition. There are 2 phases with 0 checkpoints. You only have whatever rings you've brought in from Act 2, and you can be insta-killed by a bottomless pit. It's an agonizingly slow, largely automated fight where all you can do is dodge and wait for an opening. At first, I didn't understand what to do. I was hitting the blue bombs back at Robotnik, but his mech was blocking them. It took me longer than I'd like to admit before realizing I had to knock one back, get behind him while he's blocking it, and then bounce a second bomb at his rear to score a hit. And for anyone else who was confused by that, you are welcome. I then got killed by a desperation attack near the end and had to restart the fight. Thankfully, Attempt 2 got me to Phase 2, where he rewinds time again. This second phase feels a lot like part of the Sonic 3 and Knuckles fight against a very similar mech, only without the opportunities for extra damage, the return of the annoying and slow anti-gravity gimmick from Act 2, and another late pattern shakeup that caught me off guard and sent me right back to Phase 1 again. Now, you might be thinking, Sam, you're a hypocrite. Your favourite game, Sonic 2, gives you 0 rings and 0 checkpoints for 2 back-to-back end bosses in the Death Egg Zone. Why was it okay there, and not okay here? It's a good argument, well made. The key difference is that Mecha Sonic can be taken down in a matter of seconds with practice, and even the final boss can be quickly taken care of with a ton of risk versus reward opportunities for skillful players to score extra damage. The automated boss fights of Superstars rarely provide those opportunities. You can't get so good at Phase 1 that you can beat it and be on your way to Phase 2 in about 30 seconds. No, you're going to be there for at least 3 minutes every single time. This boss was a mildly irritating tedium that took 4 attempts over about 25 minutes of real time to defeat. Little did I know it would get so much worse, but that's best saved for the super spoilers. Okay, let's get into it. Full spoilers ahead. Turn back now if you don't want Superstar's biggest surprises revealed for you. You probably could have guessed that Trip would join Sonic and his friends. We can see early on that Fang is treating her poorly, and we all saw the preview of Amy carrying Trip on her back. That's pretty much all it takes for Trip to defect. What I didn't expect was that she would be playable, and she would get a more difficult sequel campaign that evokes Knuckles' playthrough from, well, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It even has Egg Robo replacing all of the bosses and everything. Learning more about Trip feels like listening to someone enthusiastically describe their Sonic OC to you. Well, she has Amy's double jump, and Knuckles' ability to climb walls, but when she climbs walls or spin dashes, she has Vector's silhouette from Chaotix. Oh, and her super form is a massive dragon that can breathe fire and fly like Tails, but with simpler controls and without getting tired. She is very much a Swiss Army knife of a character, which ironically leaves her without much identity of her own, besides maybe her unusual super form. She parrots and combines other characters without bringing anything new to the table. Trip, and by extension the game as a whole, feels like a band releasing yet another greatest hits album rather than giving us something new. While it's true that Trip's campaign assumes we have access to, and makes much more use of, the new, largely situational, and arguably Wisp derivative Chaos Emerald powers, the game still felt like it was lacking a clever evolution or subversion of the Sonic formula. Nothing that only this outing can provide, and nought that moves the series forward. Although, that stagnation is perhaps part of a larger problem. I was especially frustrated with Trip's final boss. Trip faces off against Fang, who is everything wrong with this game's boss design rolled into a single encounter. He is cycle-based, you can't speedrun him, he has 2 phases with no checkpoints, and, worst of all, he has insta-kill attacks. It took me 3 straight hours to beat this boss. That time mainly consisted of repeating the same 3 to 5 minutes against Phase 1, just to learn and practice Phase 2's pattern and die to a new attack or retaliation I hadn't seen yet. The game was wasting my time. I had proven multiple times that I had Phase 1 down, but I had to repeat it just for another chance at Phase 2. The Spiderweb Popgun insta-kill combo was Phase 2's worst trick by far, followed closely by its Desperation Headbutt. I hated this boss. I swore at my TV, I wanted to turn the game off and come back later with a cooler head, but not only are there no checkpoints in the fight itself, turning off the game and returning means redoing the near 10-minute long Act 2 just to get back to this fight. This was a really sour note to end the game on. When Fang finally went down, I didn't feel accomplished, I was just glad it was over and gave my TV screen a firm middle finger. Trip's campaign overall felt less like a satisfying hard mode, and more like the game designer saying, what if we were dicks about it? Turned out, I wasn't done yet! Beating both the main campaign and Trip's, and also collecting the Chaos Emeralds, unlocks a last story, which is a supersonic boss battle against a massive dragon that, while it only took 3 attempts to beat, is another 8-minute 2-phase fight with no checkpoints. Do not use the boost, it costs rings to use and provides little to no benefit. Look out for Tails and Knuckles as they fly in and drop rings. For the side-on section, literally just fly from the top to the bottom and back again to easily weave through everything. It's no doomsday zone, but the attempt is appreciated. It did make me realise something though. I don't know what the story is supposed to be here. The pre-release comic and animation show us that Robotnik is looking for a dragon mural. I initially saw Trip transform and wondered if she was that dragon, but then an evil black dragon appears as our Monster of the Week Supersonic final boss, so maybe that's what Robotnik was trying to unleash and control? Why is Trip's super form so unique? Why isn't she involved in the final battle for a classic Light Dragon vs Dark Dragon finale? How do the twin dragons fit into the time manipulation? We reach the last zone and Robotnik starts rewinding time. Is he somehow using the dragon's powers to achieve this? Are they two separate plans? What's going on? What's the end game here? Through both relying on external media to explain things and its in-game wordless pantomime approach, I came away not really knowing what had happened. This is something that Sonic 3 and Knuckles pulled off perfectly almost 30 years ago. As it is, I'm left with questions I feel should have been answered. The spoiler stuff doesn't massively impact my takeaway of the game. It's fun enough, a solid attempt all round, I'm glad I played it, but it's also not an essential game. You can skip this and miss nothing. As always, thanks for watching. A huge shout out to my Patreon members who are Crow, Tiny Jericho, Mr. Terry Chaos, Guma Spice, and Ducky Go. If you'd like to get early access to scripts and raw audio of these videos, be sure to join the Patreon from as little as £1 a month. You can also support the channel for free by liking, commenting, and subscribing. There's already over 10 years of content for you to enjoy, and much more to come in the near future. I'm currently doing a Batman Arkham retrospective, with the next planned video being all about Arkham City. I hope to see you there.